No. Okay. So hi everyone, this is Med Mentors Monday, and the theme of our talk today is going to be about getting involved in extracurricular events. My name is Emmanuel, but I go by Manny. I'm a fourth year medical student applying to PM&R. And so if our panelists could just briefly introduce themselves, what specialty they're interested in going into or applied to, and then something fun you did this past weekend.
I can start. Oh, sorry. If Leslie wants to go first.
I'll actually go first real quick. I'll be out for the first 20 minutes of this meeting. So hi, all of our attendees. I'll be back for a later part. But my name is Wes Armstrong. I'm a first year medical student. I'm in the MSTP program. And I'm really interested in hematology oncology or any of the oncologies right now. And I was in Joshua Tree this past weekend. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rog. I'm a PhD 1 in the MSTP. And what was the other thing? Like what we did last weekend?
Or just something fun you did in the past week.
Oh, I mean, I've just been working. I'm not that exciting. Sorry. All right, let's pass it on.
Hi, I'm an MS1, also in the MSTP program. And something fun that I did this weekend was I just picked up my new baby kitten. So I have a little terror at home that I've been having fun.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abhinaya Ramakrishnan, but most people just call me Abhi. I'm a first year here at DGSOM, and this past weekend I went to Knott's Berry Farm. Oh, and I'm interested in interventional radiology. I forgot to mention that.
Awesome. Did everyone get the chance to go? Great. Okay. Give me 1 second. So the first topic of today that I'd like to kind of delve into and talk about would be clinical experiences and shadowing. So we all know that shadowing can be a really important part for us to be able to kind of get a hand on what it's actually like to be a physician and to get experience in clinical setting. So my first question for our panelists is, were you able to get a shadowing experience? And if so, how did you go about doing that? And anyone feel free to answer.
Yeah, this might be a little hard because I think the incoming class, most of us came in the era of COVID. So shadowing was a little difficult. I was able to get like virtual scribing positions. So I was able to like listen and experience physician-patient interactions kind of through that path, I guess. And that was pretty useful. And how I got that was I just looked on LinkedIn and Handshake.
Yeah, going off of Sophie, as a fellow MS1, it was definitely difficult. I also didn't take any gap years, so I'm coming straight from undergrad. So because of that, almost 2.5 years of my undergraduate education were limited in terms of clinical experience due to the pandemic and all the restrictions of the hospital. I was fortunate to have a medical center attached to my undergraduate institution. So we had a shadowing program through my university that I was able to partake in for the first 3 semesters of undergrad. And I was able to do considerable amount of shadowing then. I also did a bit of clinical research in undergrad that also gave me a little bit more exposure to a physician and kind of like a shadowing environment as well.
Yeah, I mean, I came in before COVID, but I also had a very limited shadowing experience. I'm not sure how common shadowing is, but I did I think I did legitimate like 6 hours or 8 hours. And I think it was like a family friend.
I mean, I think that sounds good. You guys touched on some good points. If you're involved with research and the person you're doing research is also a clinician, that could be a great resource to possibly get involved with shadowing. Always using those connections you have and having that network is really important too. For myself, before I actually started medical school, I was part of a program called the Pathmaker internship in San Diego. And through that, I kind of met a physician who did a split between private and public practice. So I was able to kind of shadow him in his private sector practice. So in addition to, doing the shadowing part, any kind of clinical experience you can get can be very useful. So the next question I have for you all is, if were you able to do, if not shadowing, some kind of hospital volunteering or other meaningful clinical experience?
Yeah, I could start off. So I'm from New York City. So I went to undergrad at Columbia. So I actually volunteered at the affiliated University Health Center, which is New York Presbyterian. I actually did it at Cornell while at Columbia, but in the same health system. There usually are volunteer programs, dedicated programs that you can apply to. You just look it up. I'll be honest, like I don't think they allow you to really do much, like in terms of actual patient care, because it's a hospital, you're not licensed, right? So I think I did a lot of just like sitting around and studying for the MCAT while I was studying, but the main point of volunteering for me was getting exposed to patients. I did get to talk to a lot of patients. I would be put on those 24-hour watches that the nurses would have me do. So that was definitely an experience. And those were all very important for, my eventual clinical vignettes that I was able to write about for medical school applications, and also informing, whether I want to be a doctor as well. I don't think the clinical experience you get at a hospital is super meaningful because they don't allow you to do much. But it's a great way to get good vignettes for your essays. So that's my takeaway from it.
Yeah, kind of.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, going off of that. So I also volunteered in a hospital, but I only did that for like 2 weeks and then I quit. I volunteered at my university center. So I went to Vanderbilt for undergrad. So I volunteered at Vanderbilt Medical Center. Basically they had me roll this cart around the transplant floor and ask these patients if they wanted anything from said cart. It was on Sundays from 1 to 3, and all the patients wanted to do was sleep. They did not want to interact with me. They were like, why is this person annoying me? So I realized that that was not something that I found fulfilling, and I did not want to continue it. So instead I volunteered at hospice for a while up until COVID. And then I also had the opportunity to volunteer at a transgender clinic, which was probably one of my most inspirational, and probably one of the things I wrote in my MCAS application is something that was very meaningful to me, because being in the South, the transgender clinic was one of the only transgender clinics for 100-mile radius. So we had a lot of patients that had incredible life stories, and being able to interact and work with them was something that I found really fulfilling. Another comment about clinical experience that I do think is important to mention is that because I have absolutely no training, no one's going to trust me to do anything. But I would highly recommend people, if they do have the ability and the financial resources, to become a CNA, become a phlebotomist, get some basic EMT training, become a farm tech. Those are all opportunities that local community colleges often offer, and you can get those certifications in a month or 2 months over the summer. My sister did that, and then she worked as a CNA for 2 years in high school. So highly recommend if you have the opportunity to do one of those courses, because then you don't have to worry about shadowing or clinical exposure as much, because you are working and you're also able to get paid while doing some of these requirements.
Of what V said, for a lot of other professions, you actually are required to kind of get paid. So if you are looking into PA school, volunteering actually does not count as a clinical experience, so it's really important, depending on where you are in your pipeline of deciding to kind of think about those things. And if you do have that opportunity to get training, it's really beneficial to do it in a field that could also count as clinical hours in another training program.
And I think you guys all bring up very fair points too, that sometimes those pre-medical clinical experiences may not feel like the most engaging or the best use of your time. But I think that with any experience in the hospital, you can always just observe too. And even if you didn't get to do as much, at least you got to see something, and that's always something worth talking about. But transitioning to, I think that it is important to find something where you're active and actually doing something meaningful, because letters of recommendation are important, and they can really help our applications, or they help their applications getting into medical school. So for any of the experiences you guys shared, did any of them result in a letter of recommendation? Or if you weren't able to get a letter of recommendation, maybe you guys can just talk about why you weren't able to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I told you about my limited shadowing experience. Yeah, I got a letter of recommendation out of it, just from the volunteer coordinator saying, yes, Rog did, XYZ hours over one summer, and this was what he did. It was not super impactful. I mean, I think one thing to know is, like, I'm an MD PhD student, right? So they don't really care about your clinical experience. So it's probably a bad example. Like, if you're interested in MD PhD, they don't, that's great. Like, they don't really care about your clinical experience that much. So that's okay for me. That obviously does not fly if you're applying to like pure MD. Pure MD, you do want like an impactful clinical experience and maybe a good letter of recommendation from that. So I know what I described was very bare bones, but there's a reason it was bare bones, because I cared about the research mostly.
Yeah, so my shadowing, because it was with my clinical research person, resulted in a letter of recommendation, because it was like kind of a combined letter. When I was shadowing, I also got to meet a few other people who were doing other lines of research. And then I also work with them on like collaborative projects that led to further letters of recommendation. And I think they all kind of grouped together and wrote one giant letter, just because I didn't want to send, tens of 15 letters or whatever. On the other end, in terms of like my transgender clinic work, that did not lead to a letter of recommendation necessarily, but what that did lead to was another research project that I ended up doing as part of my honors thesis in public health, where I was analyzing access to mental health care for individuals who are in the LGBTQ+ spectrum. And that like volunteering experience really motivated the research that I ended up doing in the space. And it was something that I talked a lot about throughout my interview cycle, because it was something that I listed as one of the most meaningful. So being able to draw from those experiences and talk about like why I was interested in LGBTQ+ care and like the effect that that clinical experience had on me was definitely something that I do think made my application stronger. I would also like to mention that I'm an MD only student. I'm not an MSTP student. So for me, like those clinical experiences did matter a lot in my application, and something that I drew from for my personal statement, for my meaningful experience, etc. Because of course I'm not doing research as much in undergrad as like the other MSTP students are. So they definitely want to know that I'm invested in becoming a doctor.
Kind of building off and listening to what everybody else is saying, right? Like, it really, the things that matter to you are the things that you should really be picking for your letters of rec. Just because you did 6 hours of shadowing, right, does not mean it's going to be like the most, like the star letter that you're going to really draw on to get your applications in. While with the B, like, she did all that clinical research, she did all those collaborations, and she really worked on building those relationships there. So that was why that letter was so potent for her application. So I think that the thing to focus on with these clinical experiences is to really try and find something that you care about and that you don't mind investing in, and that you actually look forward to doing, and that you're learning a lot. So like, for instance, I did volunteering. I did over 100 hours of volunteering in a hospital, but I kind of was more invested with the patients than I was with any of the coordinators or the providers. So I didn't feel like I would get a really good letter of rec from it. And so I would actually invest more of my time in my research letters for medical school. So it just depends on what you think is of value and what you want to highlight in your application. Because even if you don't have a letter of rec, as Abhi did, she put it as a most impactful, most meaningful experience or whatever. And you can describe what you did there. So there are different avenues to highlight what you did somewhere, and the letter of rec is just one option.
And I think you guys bring up the good point that, it's not necessarily what you signed up for at first, but what you found the most meaningful out of all the experiences that you did. And I think that will reflect stronger your letter of recommendation, because if you're passionate or you care about what you're doing, I think that your supervisors can pick up on that. But I'm also impressed that all of you guys are so involved with research earlier on before medical school. So I think a question that comes up a lot is, let's say someone has not really had too much experience in research or doesn't know how to get started. How would you recommend or how would you advise someone who may not have a lot of experience in research to go ahead and get started?
Yeah. So I guess it really depends what year you are, but let's just start off. Let's say you're a freshman and this is your first time, you're in university, right? You want to get involved in research. I got involved as a freshman. It's very possible. I think it's better to get involved earlier so you have a longer longitudinal experience in research so you can talk about for medical school. In terms of getting research opportunities, there's an art form and it's called, bombing people's inbox. You're going to email every professor you are interested in and, be very liberal about it. I think I sent like 40, 50 emails. And then you are going to talk to your professors who, you have in like a small discussion section or anything, see if they know any colleagues that are looking for undergrad assistance during the term and work during term time part-time. That's what I did. Generally you don't get paid. Maybe you can find a fellowship to fund it. The summers are really your golden opportunity to find research as well. I think there's a Bruin in Genetics program, which connects you to mentors as well. But generally most schools, especially UCLA, will have a summer program that's structured, matches you to a mentor, or will at least fund your research opportunity. If you cannot find one or you don't get into it, I would recommend you look at other universities. Every university basically has one of these summer programs and they take people who are not going to that university. So look into these like summer research at a different university programs and apply to them and apply very liberally. And you'll get a research opportunity. It'll be funded and it'll be a good experience. And those are letters that will, stack up for your medical school application. And don't be afraid to switch labs if you don't like it, you don't like the topic, you don't like the PI. I switched labs, totally fine. But yeah, that's how I would say, getting involved in research works. It's the same strategy as Tinder.
So I went to a university kind of similar to UCLA, very large undergrad population. Honestly, there weren't as many labs as there were undergrads looking for labs, so it was actually really challenging. So I applied through the university conventional programs that they had at my school. Wasn't able to get research through there. So again, cold emailing. A big barrier for me was that I did not know how to craft a cold email. So UCI, actually, if you look up UCI research cold email or something, they have a template. It's not amazing, but it at least gets something on the page. So you can edit it and fix it that way for you. The other thing that you could do is look at the REUs that Rog mentioned. Those are actually, if you look on the AAMC website, you can actually find them. They're called research educational, university programs or something, experience. And the other thing you can do is look at biotech opportunities. So if you have done like a bio lab or something, you can apply to internships. And then the other thing you can do is look at study abroad programs that incorporate research. The other point I want to make is that research does not have to be bio related. It does not have to be science related. It can be humanities. You can write up a literature review of, something. You can analyze some sort of English text. You can do anything really and consider it research if that's something that interests you. Research does not have to be painful. You can, as long as you do something that you're interested in.
Yeah, going along those lines, so my first research position in undergrad was actually through someone I emailed to shadow. So Vanderbilt had a policy where they wouldn't let freshmen or sophomores in the operating rooms. So I didn't know that, and I emailed a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist interested in doing some sort of shadowing opportunity. And then I had to go back and renege after he had said, okay, yeah, you can come shadow me on X date, and be like, oh, my university policy does not allow me to do this. And I was really lucky that he actually emailed back and said, oh, that's fine, but I have this other research opportunity. Do you want to get involved in that? So that's kind of how I got involved in research early on. And I followed through with that really up until COVID. COVID happened and I was like, oh, I need to do research. And I couldn't continue with my clinical research program because of limitations at the university. So I pivoted and actually spent 2 years doing public health and health policy research. Going off of the humanities theme, I was a public health major and I needed to do something for my senior honors thesis. And I analyzed, like I said before, mental health use and access to healthcare for transgender individuals. And at the end of the day, that was actually what I wrote as like my most like meaningful experience in terms of research, not the clinical research that I did or like some of the basic science research that I dabbled in. It was actually something that was like humanities related. And I think for me, that was like a big thing in interviews as well, because that was something that a lot of people and mentors and physicians and people could relate to. It wasn't about a specific pathway or a specific gene I was studying, but something that they were innately working with and a question that they were also thinking about. So that was definitely something that I found really fulfilling. I was able to publish as well, which I do think was something that helped my application. Yeah.
And I think you guys bring up fair points about, sometimes in this process, it is casting a wide net and being open to things that might not seem like what you typically constitute, I guess, scientific research or medical school, but doing something that you find interesting and that you can do meaningful work in. So one question that I think would be important for people to understand is what kinds of information or how do you express interest in an email, or what things should you talk about in an email when you're reaching out to a laboratory and trying to say, hey, I'm interested, are there any projects available?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important question. If you don't have mentors that help you with this, it's almost impossible to figure out how the right phrasing. So I think the way I phrased my email structure was like, dear Dr. blah, blah, blah. I'm an undergraduate in this year studying this. I'm really interested in your work. I read your recent paper, or I saw your poster, or blah, 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 why you're interested in their work. If you have any past experience doing research, that's always a bonus, or any coursework, you can mention that right after that and say, please, I would love to talk to you about if you have any opportunities in your lab. Here is my CV, and attach your CV. Looking for and then maybe give your availability, right? Like if you want to meet, and say best whatever your name is. And I think it's just keep it shorter, on the shorter side, and then don't be afraid to bug them a lot, like 2-3 follow-up emails. I personally need to get bugged a lot, and so professors need to get bugged even more. So bug them, send your CV. And again, it's just a numbers game, right? You really got to reach out to a lot of people. If you get rejected a lot, don't get discouraged. It's not about you. It's like a funding thing, or they don't have space, and have a project, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I would flip it. How I did it was I talked about the research that I was interested in first, then I talked about myself, and then I asked if I could even talk to them about their research and a potential research opportunity. The other thing that I found really useful is kind of how professors get a ton of emails. Postdocs and PhD students get less emails. So if you see people that you see are kind of earlier on in their time in the lab, like first or second year in the lab, they're probably going to be there for a little longer and are probably going to be looking for people to help them. So if you CC the BCC, if you really want to, those people, then you're also going to have a person on the inside who knows that you're applying, who's not the professor, and who can kind of nag and push you along a little bit more. You can also ask your friends if they're in a lab and email their lab and kind of have them mention that you applied to. It's helpful. Yeah.
And Sophie, I think that point that you brought up, I wish I had been told that when I was looking for research positions, trying to maybe reach out to some of the younger members who are probably eager to have some young minds helping them with their research would have been a pretty wise move on my part. So transitioning away from research, I think another major aspect about doing extracurriculars outside of school is volunteering and finding things that are meaningful. So I think the next thing I'd like to kind of ask you guys about was there a particular experience, either clinical or non-clinical, that you found very useful in your application process, or something that you found that you talked about a lot when you applied to medical school?
studied abroad. So Berkeley has this program, no matter what school you go to, you can apply to it. It's called Global Internships Program. I think I mentioned it on a previous panel. And basically you go abroad and you intern 4 days a week and you take classes 1 day a week. And it was a really special opportunity to be able to engage with the different culture, engage with people from different perspectives. For me, I practiced research in an area where resources were a lot more scarce. So we had to be a little bit more specific about and precise about what we wanted and really plan out experiments a little bit more. So that was something that I talked about a lot during my interviews about, oh, how do you deal with people in conflict or blah, blah, blah. It was something that was easily referenceable and something that, you know, was a positive experience that I could talk about, you know, funny instances that I wasn't expecting. So I recommend that if you have the opportunity to study abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sophie took my answer as well. I think I won some sort of fellowship to go to Cambridge because I wanted to work with this PI for like a year. And I think that was what I talked about the most in all my interviews. It was the most ridiculous thing. Like you'd be surprised how many people went to Cambridge and want to talk about Cambridge all the time. So I would just talk about rowing or something. So yeah, doing an opportunity abroad, regardless of what it is, whether it be a study abroad thing, whether you win some sort of, whether you apply for some fellowship and win that, I think those are really meaningful. I've seen people do, just take. I think my brother's doing this. Like he applied directly to another university for like a year, so he's there now. So I think that's also another way to do it. Just having like a completely different experience that you can talk about. Is fantastic. I also think another thing I talked about is sports. I don't think people know, but people love talking about sports during interviews and just during the process. I think it's a very weird bias, but you know, having do some sort of club sport or competitive sport even, I talked a lot about that and you know, the team building and what my experience was. And I think that was a really valuable experience.
Everyone, I'm going to jump in. I know I've been out for a minute, but I'm just going to confirm like this question was most notable clinical or non-clinical volunteer experience. And for me as an undergrad, I think Sophie probably mentioned a little bit, but like research is important. You know, I'm an MSCP and I think a lot of us will do research. I think one of the ways that I utilized that, it was really important to me just doing the research and it was something I was interested in. But at the same time, I think when you want to turn that into something that's curtailed to you and you're talking about in an interview, I talked more so not about like the research that I did and like the quality of it, but about what it means to me in my future career as a physician. It looks like Sophie probably said this in almost the same way, but for me, it was, I did a lot of pharmaceutical development. I've been interested in oncology and that's something I'd like to keep doing. But when you actually dive into a lot of these clinical and clinically adjacent fields, you start to see impacts of the like overall institution that is medicine. And so for me, something that's like really drives me is access to new pharmaceuticals or just access to clinical trials or the access of care in general, but this particular niche as well. I think that was something that like set aside me talking about research in my interviews from just talking about research, because I could talk about research questions and I love that, but I also could talk about, you know, we did this and I see how it's clinically translatable, but I also see how it's a you know, a pretty well-owned pharmaceutical patent that's going to be challenging to get into like an affordable measure, especially because it's in a somewhat niche, you know, cancer, like I did pancreas cancer. And so like they rack up charges on a lot of those and there's a lot of issue. Like I did clinical stuff and some of my patients, it's really hard for them to get certain standard care therapy. It's this whole debacle. So I think seeing beyond how these things are like a singular experience and how they relate to what you might be developing, even if it's a nascent idea, but of how you want to be a clinician and how you want to change care for patients or bring new care to patients and what you're actually passionate about. You don't have to be passionate about the huge experience you did, but you can take that experience and show how it's developed some idea of something you are passionate about and really want to immerse yourself in. Actually, the meeting I was just at is for our American Medical Association, like student things, so it's like policy. So it's something I became passionate about after all of this is I want to be part of changing access to care and changing the way legislation interacts with medicine and we bring care, even though that's very distinct from what I did that brought me to that passion.
That's a great segue to me, Wes. So I spent a lot of time on the discipline or field of mental health. that was something that I like fully did like everything possible for. And that was like my other hobby outside of like, the typical pre-med stuff. So I was part of a mental health club on campus where we were working with a lot of the professors to include mental health resources as part of their syllabus. We did a lot of like de-stress events, those types of things on campus. I was part of like NAMI, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and I was helping to run outreach events at all the schools in Metro Nashville area, where we would go into all these like middle schools and elementary schools and teach them about like different mental health resources, how to help friends, really just like bringing mental health awareness. I was on like a substance use and mental health panel for like the Department of Education in like Tennessee. I did research in mental health. I worked on smartphone apps for mental health. So really anything mental health related, I probably did. I did a lot of policy work my final 2 years as well. So for me, that was like my other thing is like, I was really involved in mental health that I was like, what else can I do? What else do I need to do? What else is there in the community that like I can help with? So that I think drove me down like a completely different arena outside of like the stereotypical pre-med stuff. But that's like really what I devoted most of my time to outside of like the day-to-day activities.
I think you guys all do a great job of highlighting that there's a whole wide diversity of experiences outside of medicine, outside of preclinical exposure that can be meaningful and that could help you, I guess, kind of build yourself as a person and build your resume of life and do things that not only have an impact on you, but are also things you can talk about in your medical school applications. One thing that I feel a lot of students have asked me questions about in the past is there a need or is there an importance in belonging to a pre-health or pre-medical student organization or club? So my question to all of you is, were any of you a part of a pre-medical or pre-health student club or organization? And did you find it helpful in your journey to applying to medical school?
So I actually joined a club and was kind of in charge of the professional development segment in undergrad. And for me at my school, it was kind of the resources a bit provided by the school were very minimal. So being able to have med mentors is something that you guys should be incredibly grateful for and like take advantage of all the opportunities that med mentors organizes for you. That was not the case at my school. So for me, it was incredibly helpful because we were kind of working all together as a club to really reframe the nature of the mental pre-med culture at the school from one that was competitive to one that was collaborative. So for me, for instance, it was, oh, let's share all of the resources and all the opportunities that we're finding, like those research opportunities, internships, volunteering, shadowing, all of these things, so that everybody can kind of find their little route to medicine and what makes them happy, and not do absolutely everything under the sun because that's what they think they have to do, but they can kind of really dive in and enjoy certain aspects of their time in undergrad.
I was not part of any pre-med club. Yeah, I don't think it was totally necessary. Obviously I did go to UCLA undergrad. But we didn't really have, I don't think there really was a pre-med club where I went. So I don't think it was super necessary. I used the pre-med club called Student Doctor Network, which is extremely toxic. But I really did just go online to figure out how things worked. I didn't find that like the clubs were necessary at all.
Yeah, I also didn't join pre-med clubs or anything, but we did have like a health professions advisory office as part of our university, and they had a system where all these med schools would come and like admissions officers would come and like just speak about their med school. So I'd go to some of those whenever I could just to like learn a bit more about the different schools, curriculum, whatnot.
I was in a group that was it was like a club organization thing that was like an undergrad run research group for our emergency department. So that kind of was a catch-all there. And I found it to be like a pretty positive experience. I think really anytime you join a group of people where they're all interested in like the same thing, you have to take it always with a grain of salt of like sometimes, some people are going to be that hardcore competitive, toxic pre-med gunner. That is true. And one of my classmates just pointed at me. It's a little hurts me, but you know, I think really you will find that, and that's not always a bad thing to be around. If you let yourself use that as a way to go, oh, do I need to be like this? Like, is this truly what it takes to go to med school? Are these really the ways that I need to push myself? Or is this something that's just a way of looking at med school as like a checklist? And I think on the other hand of being in that group, there were amazing people who did it because they were passionate about it, who really cared about going to med school for doing what you go to med school for, which is caring for people and learning how, like growing into someone who can really provide great care. And so you always have to just be aware that joining these clubs, you're going to get both sides of the coin, but you can learn from both sides, and you can be friends with groups of people because they're going to be your colleagues because they both get into good schools. That's the thing. And I think that's a really important thing to also just come to understand and see where you fit. You know, for some people, it just is better to you thrive in like pushing yourself, and as long as you're just not hurting other people with that, which is the real toxic thing, it either can work with people. It's just what's best. It's what's your best path.
Looking at the chat, I think, so this is a little bit of a deviation, but something also I think important when considering volunteering and clinical and non-clinical experiences. Did any of you consider taking a gap year before you started medical school? And if you did, why did you? Or if you did not take a gap year, what made you decide to go the straight shot and go straight from undergraduate into medical school?
I can definitely talk about gap years. I knew I wanted to do an MSTP or an MD PhD program. And I would actually say that regardless if I had wanted to do that or not, I think the gap years were a huge positive. I think going straight in certainly has its benefits just because it's a long road and this is a very long journey, but as well, I mean, there's many of my classmates who are much older, and what they bring to the table is immense. They have so much life experience. They're kind and compassionate. And once you get to this, you know, the med school level, right? Like you're in that level of grad school, all the how good you are of a student matters, but it doesn't matter so much. It's more about like how good you are at really at fitting into this profession. And I think that having a few gap years, I'm much more happy with who I am now than who I was coming right out of undergrad. I think that I grew quite a bit and experienced a lot. And it also gives you time if you're doing something that you love. It's easy to forget that some of these things we're never going to have the opportunity to do again to quite the same extent. Or just to have a different experience. Maybe you want to work abroad, maybe you want to work in a lab. Some of these things are things that you won't have that same experience, be it because you'd be at a different level when you're doing it, or you won't quite fit into the program quite the same way. And if you see it being something you just want to do and have been a part of your life, or just live somewhere, whatever it might be, it's a wonderful opportunity. I think med schools look very positively on that, especially when you can say, I really grew in X, Y, and Z way. And I just think that I've really, not, you have to say you matured, but really demonstrate that it matured you.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't take a gap year. I think there is a trend towards more gap years, at least for MD PhDs. There's a paper about this trend. I think actually also for medical school, this is also the trend for gap years. I think I think my thought process was I was ready to go in terms of I had everything ready for my application. So I was just going to apply that year, my junior year, and just go straight through. I think with gap years, if you there is a enormous opportunity cost, right? You're putting up, right? You're losing 1 year of attending salary, 1 year of your career, which is actually quite substantial if you're going to medicine, because everything is so backloaded in terms of compensation. Another thing is that I've seen people like kind of reject themselves from medical school. They will say, "Oh, I'm not good enough," or "I'm not ready." I think if you are meeting like all the boxes and you're checking off those things, you're actually ready to apply. And if there's very little I think benefit you're going to get from that extra year unless you have like a really good plan to like really boost your application with some substantial opportunity. So I think people actually end up like auto rejecting themselves. And I know what happened for my my undergrad is that the pre-health department their metrics are based off, can we get into medical school? Can we get people into medical school, right? It's not based off, can we get you into the best medical school or what's do best for you? So there's like an incentive disalignment. And so they actually kind of push people towards more gap years when they don't necessarily need them, because a 25-year-old is going to have a better chance getting in than like a 21-year-old. So you got to be aware of that there's actually a lot of pressure to go into a gap year when you might not really need one, or it might not be necessary, and it's actually fine to go straight through. So in terms of thinking about the gap year decision, see if you're ready, see if you have all the things ready, and you could theoretically apply, and I think give it your best shot. I think really only take a gap year if you know you're not ready or you're missing some substantial part of your application.
So I chose a gap year, and it was very deliberate in me choosing it. I went through undergrad, basically focusing on school, focusing on extracurriculars, not really taking care of myself as an individual, because that was what I loved. I was obsessed with lab. I spent way too much time there. And so when I got the opportunity to do an internship after my junior year, I took it, and I deliberately decided I'm taking a gap year. It was the best thing for me. I discovered rock climbing. I discovered that I actually really do enjoy living with pets. And so now I have the cat as of last week. I discovered, that hiking is really important to me. And I learned how to manage life outside of school and actually redevelop my passion for school, which is something that I don't think I would have had if I had gone straight through. Now, because I knew I was going to take a gap year, there are a few things that I did that I really encourage you to do if you are planning on taking a gap year. Take your MCAT before you graduate, get your letters of rec in order, make sure that you at least have some sort of draft of your personal statement so that you at least know kind of what's going on. And the other thing is take a note of all the extracurriculars and the hours and the contacts that you're going to use for those, because those are all things that are going to take more time and are things that you're not really going to want to do when you're working versus when you're in school and already doing all those things. So I think that is something that will help you keep the number of gap years shorter and still be able to get everything done. But yeah, there's benefits to going straight through for sure. I knew for myself that I would not do as well, and I would not appreciate it as much if I'd gone straight through.
So I did not take a gap year. I'm coming straight through. I graduated in May, and here I am. So for me, I knew that I always wanted to become a doctor. That was never a question. So coming into my freshman year, I really laid out a plan of when I'm going to take each of my courses, when I'm going to take my MCAT, etc. And I really did my best to follow through with the plan. Of course, COVID happened. So some of the stuff got wobbled around, but at the end of the day, I think that I took the MCAT when I wanted to. I applied last year, in 2021, and then came straight through. For me, a big part of the decision was, is there something else that I think that I would find more fulfilling right after graduating that'd be more than me going to medical school and being able to fulfill a lifelong dream. And for me, I am very active in the dance community. I'm a traditionally trained Indian dancer. It's something that I've always done, a big part of what I do in my free time. And for me, to be able to do that at a professional level was not really reasonable, because that would require me to move to India and be there for 7 years and train and then come back. And I just realized that yes, that's my passion, but would I do it for a whole year, and would I do that full time, and would that bring me a lot of joy? Yes and no, because my knees are horrible right now. So I'd probably get injured very fast, and I would it was not really a sustainable path for me, just given my body's conditions. So I decided to apply straight through, and there was nothing else that I felt like I was missing out on. I have friends who have taken gap years and who have been in a point where they're should I take a gap year or not? And they've taken gap years and did things that they've always wanted to do, whether that be traveling, whether that be doing a master's program in something that's completely unrelated, working in a different field. So I didn't feel like there was anything that I desperately wanted to do that going to medical school would inhibit me from doing. So that's the reason that I went straight through. It's not for everyone. I would say our class, there's maybe 4 or 5 people in a class of 180 that went straight through. So gap years are becoming more common. So if there's anything that you feel can improve your application substantially, and or that you like really, really want to do it now, because like the way my mentor often phrased it is like, you're at the top of the hill when you start med school and you're just going to keep rolling down. There's like no real way to stop it. So if there's anything you want to do it before you get to the top of the hill, because you're just going to be rolling down and it's hard for you to do it later on in life.
I real quick want to add in the chat, or there's two questions in the chat. One is about MSTPs, why we considered it, and then undergrad research experience. And then the other is about getting involved in clinical research. I'm going to kind of try to answer them together really quick. Or not really quick, probably. But for me, my undergraduate experience in research, there was half of it was like 4 years of clinical research, and the other half was some basic science, molecular pharmacology, both really patient-centric experiences. Even the basic science was preclinical pharmaceutical development in the context of treating cancer, and I worked with MD-only PIs. My highlight to that is, I think if you want to consider MSTP, probably what's going to have you doing that is experiencing research in the many forms and understanding how that integrates into a career in medicine. So what questions do you want to answer? How do you want to bring that to the table in regards to patient care? Or how do you want that to just like actually just fit in overall? And the best way to do that is by partaking in research, and even if you're not, like, I would recommend it as an undergrad if it's an opportunity, because I just think it's a great experience. You learn so much, and I think it even helps with your classes and a lot of the other things you do in undergrad. But more so than that, is it gives you time to build the experience in research. And there's more than just knowing how to do research. It's about understanding what that career will look like. And only once you've developed relationships with grad students, postdocs, and your PIs, and you can really see them and the collaborators you work with and understand like what it would look like for you later on to integrate into that space. So you start developing a really solid idea of how you are, articulate that in an interview of like, oh, this is what I want for this dual degree path kind of career. And so the other side to that for me, I then took 3 gap years. I was a clinical trial coordinator, and I worked really in the clinical trial part of the group I worked in preclinical models in my undergrad. So it was really integrative, and I felt very MD PhD doing that because I had seen basic science. I've been doing the translational work, and then I was doing it in patients, and I was helping them, get these trials rolling. I was part of an FDA approval for a drug. All these things go together to kind of build an experience that I got to watch and see like what it would look like to be an MD PhD in like pharmaceutical development for cancer treatment. And I think the only way you're going to get that is by becoming a part of it. To be a part of any of the research experiences, I think maybe you guys talked about basic sciences, but getting involved in clinical research with real-time patient trials, it's a little trickier. It's very like a big time commitment, and it's business hours, so you can't just like generally pop in. But what I would do is look at faculty. I would look at just UCLA Health and look at clinical trials that are going on at UCLA Health. A lot of the departments will have pages, and they'll list the clinical trials for patients, and you can just see if there's faculty that actually take on grad students, if they have undergrads, et cetera. You can always just reach out, and they might not have any opportunities, but they could at least direct you to something. I know it's like a lot. I would also just recommend in general, if no one said this, I'm sorry if I'm repeating, but when you try to get into any kind of research, look at the faculty. Also look at the grad students, postdocs, undergrads that they list on their lab pages, websites. Sometimes they're going to have more time to contact you. Sometimes the grad student's going to be the one who wants to take you. A big PI isn't going to have time to always respond, but they can have, their staff might bump it up to them. So just remember that too. It might be an easier way to get involved. And there's a bunch of undergrad organizations. If you're at UCLA, I think a lot of institutions have like already existing organizations you like apply into and can do clinical research or something.
And thank you all for sharing these experiences about your gap years and whether you chose what to do a gap year or not. I think one thing that's important for all of our students to think about too is getting those all important letters of recommendation. So do you guys have any opinions or advice on when to ask for a letter of recommendation and who makes a good letter writer for you?
Yeah, depends on what you're applying to, right? So if you're applying for MD PhD programs, which is my expertise, you will want a letter from every single research advisor you have ever worked with. And that's what they look for. You'll also want a letter writer from, I think, a science professor or 2 science professors and a humanities professor. which is similar to the MD mix. I think the only big difference in MD PhD is you want like every research advisor, they really care about your research. So try to get more of the research stuff. I think in terms of like a general rule for letters, you want to ask for them very ahead of time, like very, very far ahead of time. And you want to ask people who you know really well and you know would write you a very strong letter, right? Don't ask a grad student, ask the professor. So you also want to go by seniority. But if the professor doesn't know you super well, you know, offer to write them a draft, right? Or something like that. That's another tip you should use. But yeah, ask really far in advance, ask very senior people, and ask people who you know would give you a strong recommendation, like a very strong recommendation.
For people who are MD only, I would also recommend maybe someone who is like you've done service with, volunteering with, or some sort of like extracurricular mentor. Those are also great people just to showcase that like you do care about serving people and that will be a big part of your career. So I had a letter from like a scholarship mentor that I had in undergrad because he was with me for all 4 years, and we had like a class that met every single Wednesday for those 4 years. So he got to know me really well. And then I also asked one of my directors with one of the organizations that I work with to write me a letter of recommendation as well.
So we're going to be wrapping up the evening, and I have one last question for all of our wonderful panelists. So, you know, going through this whole AMCAS process can be nerve-wracking. It can be difficult. It can be difficult to talk about your extracurricular activities, and it can be difficult to talk about yourself. So if you could go back and think about when you were filling this application out, what would be one thing you'd want to tell your previous self, or some kind of wisdom you've had looking back and now being medical students? What would you tell your pre-medical self about this process?
It's a lot more about how you experienced it and what you perceived and what you learned from everything than what you actually did, right? So like you don't need to have like the science paper or, you know, Rhodes Scholar or whatever to get into medical school. What's really important and what people really value is, well, how did you take advantage of the opportunities that you had? And how did those opportunities inform who you are as a person and who you want to be as a provider? What that means is that a lot of what you're going to be writing is about reflection. So what I would strongly encourage my previous self to do is journal, or at least bullet point my how I interpreted and how I perceive something, not just like, oh, you saw like a person not being assisted because of hospital policies and you really wanted to change it, right? Like, how did that make you feel? What did you internalize and what did you learn from that experience? And just if you're able to do that for all of your work, your experiences, you're also going to be able to do that in your personal statement and have more genuine conversations in your interviews than if you just think that who you are is what you did instead of how those things impacted you.
Journaling was going to be my, but the other thing that I would add is it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You've probably heard this a lot, but like, take care of yourself throughout. There are definitely moments in my undergraduate career where I was not eating properly. I was not taking care of myself, and definitely like take the time to take care of yourself, because that's something that I like really messed up in undergrad. So my advice to my former self would be prioritize your health, prioritize your self-care, and prioritize your mental health over anything else, because you can always take gap years. You can always figure out other ways to get to where you want, but you should try your hardest to take care of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of advice for the process, I would give myself, I would say like plan very far ahead of time, like several years ahead of time. Plan further ahead than you think you need to, because it's really, really important, because there's so many moving parts to the process, right? Your MCAT timing, your studying, then whether you need a committee letter, right? Like all this stuff interacts, and try to get as much information ahead of time as you can get, you know, from online sources or, you know, your pre-health advisor or the like. So I just think planning is the really big takeaway for me.
I want to say that, like, I think one of the you know, especially if you're going to be out of school or really whatever it is. One of the most important things to consider, and I don't mean this to scare anyone, but it is like a hard thing to be doing. It's like a lot of time and effort, and it's, you know, people don't like, you don't like casually do it. So everything everyone said about planning is very important. But what I also mean about that is like planning in regards to like where you're going to be at in your life. If you're gonna be working a lot, you know, you want to get stuff done ahead of time because you might not really have time. Like I was applying when I was working, and I was working quite a bit, so it was pretty late nights when I was actually having time to do stuff, and which is fine. But plan ahead if you can, and it helps. But maybe more so my point of that is that also there's some things we can't foresee that will happen during an application cycle. So just be aware of that. You know, getting things done preemptively is good. Be aware that if you have to take another year, it's okay. I had to take extra time because I had things happen during when I was planning to apply, and it was all fine. I'm pretty happy with where I'm at and everything, but it's definitely hard in the moment. It's very challenging to just like have those things happen in general and then have it interfere with something that really feels like an integral part of your career, and feeling like you have to waylay things, but that's life. So also be really like, just be aware of that, that you know, oh, and I got waitlisted here too, so maybe just like one of the things for like everything is like it can be a really rough process towards the end, and know that things work out, but also that like you know, things get waylaid, like it doesn't really matter. If you have to do like another cycle or whatever, like all these things are all totally fine. It seems really hard, and it seems like, oh my God, like what will I do? It doesn't really mean anything at all, actually. Like Sophie said, that it's, you know, maybe you just didn't articulate like how you're ready for medicine as well, but it's not that you weren't good enough. It certainly wasn't that you're not good enough if you felt like capable. It might just be that you didn't highlight all the best parts of you. So know that like it might be hard and things might get rough, but that you can still do it, and don't be like discouraged if it takes extra time.
With that, I wanted to thank our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules on an evening to share some of their wisdom and experiences. And we hope that you all tune in for our next Med Mentor Mondays.